A reading from the Gospel according to Luke. Now on the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Clopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word, before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some of the women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then he told them what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Here ends the reading. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Last Sunday evening, we resumed our confirmation class, and Laird Callia was leading us in a discussion of the Passion narrative. And part of his subtext was to convey to our confirmands that at every point in the narrative, someone was making a decision, whether it was Jesus, the disciples, the leaders of the ruling council. Some of the decisions were easy, some of them were hard, some of them were good, some of them were bad. At one point, we got into a discussion about Judas Iscariot and what his motivation was to betray Jesus. And to be honest, the Gospels don't really give us a good hard look into what was going on in the head of Judas. It's really an open question. And in fact, if you think even wider, the Gospels really don't give us a good look into the motivation for any of the disciples in following Jesus. We really don't know that. The Gospels are more about Jesus than they are about what is going on internally in the disciples. But there is an intriguing story at the beginning of the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that kind of stands out like a sore thumb from the rest of the stories that the Gospel contains. And that's the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Many modern scholars look at that story now and compare it to the vision quest that goes on in Native American culture, and that may be one valid way of looking at the story. But in comparing what goes on in a vision quest and looking at what happens with Jesus in the story, his answers are pretty sure and certain and don't really represent someone who is a spiritual seeker. I think the stories are about something else. I don't think the temptations of Jesus are about Jesus wrestling with what his calling is, as much as it is an opportunity for the people who write the gospel to tell us what motivated people to follow Jesus. And indeed, as the rest of the Gospels unfold, we see some people looking at Jesus as a miracle worker, someone who could give them daily bread, someone who could bring them healing. Other people look at Jesus as a radical religious reformer who would eventually climb his way to the top of Palestinian Judaism and reform it from the corrupt practices at the very top. Other people had the expectation that Jesus would rise like a Maccabean prince, a Messiah of power, and maybe even overthrow the Romans and grant independence back to Judea so that there was autonomy and self-rule. And as we go through the Gospels, we can see many people coming in and out of the stories that reflect these attitudes and hopes and expectations with Jesus. And undoubtedly, all these motivations were embedded in the minds of the disciples and those who followed Jesus into Jerusalem. Well, we know that as the story of Holy Week unfolds, and especially from Maundy Thursday on, those who follow Jesus one by one disappear from the narrative, and we find Jesus alone on the cross at the time of his death. We never hear where the disciples go. It's only after the resurrection that the story of the disciples comes back into the narrative. Last week, we heard the story of disciples gathering, sheltering in place that Jane read out of John 21. This week, we hear the story of two disciples who are engaging in radical social distancing, and this is kind of where we pick up our story. Their world has come crashing down around their ears. Their hopes and dreams, no matter what they are, have been shattered. The hope and the vision of what Jesus was going to accomplish is no more. And so they pick up the pieces, and Clopas and probably his wife begin to journey home. And we pick them up on that journey. They are sad, they are despondent, they are anxious, they are fearful. They are in the midst of utter disorientation. And in the midst of this disorientation, a stranger comes up alongside of them and begins to engage them in conversation. And to begin with, they share the stories of their shattered dreams. But in response, the stranger begins to unfold for them a whole new way to read and understand and interpret Scripture. They may be disoriented, but they are open to hearing something new and consider it. And they are carried along in the conversation all day to the end of the day. And this is where something really extraordinary happens, I think. In the midst of their disorientation, in the midst of everything falling apart in their lives, in the midst of all their hopes and dreams being shattered, yet they remember what Jesus taught them about radical hospitality. And in the midst of their meaninglessness and aimlessness, when they come to the end of the day and an end, they invite the stranger in an act of radical hospitality to share a meal with them. It's an act of normality, and it reflects what Jesus was all about with his attitude of xenophilia, that is, the love and the embrace of the stranger. And so they go in, and in this symbolic act of sharing a meal with each other, and in the act of Jesus taking, blessing, breaking, and giving the bread, the four verbs that are used in every meal that the Gospels describe about Jesus, they finally recognize their risen Lord. And in that awareness, they come to recognize the yearning that they felt all day burning in their hearts as they walked with Jesus, coming to a new understanding, and they take action on that awareness and run back to Jerusalem, only to find that they are not alone, that Jesus has appeared to others, that Jesus is risen, that there is a future. I think we are in the midst of our own disorientation. For the first several weeks of the outbreak of COVID-19, we strove mightily to deal with the disorientation that was thrust on us. We were essentially evicted from our church buildings and our sanctuary. And I don't think we really appreciated the extent to which our church facilities were central to what we do and central to our identity. And we have striven mightily to create new platforms to bring our community together, to rediscover the ties that bind us and hold us close. But by the time we got into Easter, I'd say about 90% of what we had envisioned to bring into this situation that was new to hold us together was accomplished. And since Easter, I've noticed a kind of drifting, a kind of aimlessness, as though we are nomads wandering in a wilderness, as though we are perceiving there is kind of no end to this social distancing in sight, that we cannot yet imagine what the new future is. We are in the middle of our own profound disorientation. And yet, at the same time, as I listen to us talk to each other, I sense that we are coming to a realization that even when we do get back together again and come face to face, it's not going to be quite the same as it was in the past. There are going to be some differences. There are going to be other hurdles that we have to navigate. There are going to be other challenges that we have to meet. There are going to be new problems that we have to solve. We don't quite know what they are. And so we have been engaging in our own sort of form of meaning making. We have brought mission back into the core and to the center of who we are as a church. We have identified mission partners who are in a great deal of stress, and we have stepped up in incredible ways to meet those needs. Again, these are the ordinary things of ministry that give meaning to us as a community. And I have to confess to the same sort of thing. I cannot imagine week in and week out sitting in front of my computer compiling word upon word upon word. Like you, I feel the need to act my Christianity out with authenticity, to find new ways to embrace the stranger, to find ways to give food to the hungry, shelter to the homeless, comfort to the grieving, to find a way forward to knit our community back together. And as I have engaged in this process, I have discovered that there is a yearning inside of me. There is a sacred God space inside of me that is growing. And like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, I find an increasing burning in my heart. And so I am learning to pay more deep attention to that sacred yearning. And I encourage you to do so as well. I have a feeling that as we get back together again and we rediscover what it is to be church face to face, and we engage in new ways of doing that and have new ideas, the answer is not going to come at us from somewhere else outside of us. The answer is not going to be flipped on like a light switch. The answer, I think, is going to be found deep within as we pay attention to our sacred yearnings. And so in this time of disorientation, this time of discomfort, I encourage us all to look deep within, to listen to that still small voice of God, to identify the points of yearning, to lift them out, to share them. Because I think it's when we bring those yearnings together collectively that we will see a larger pattern emerge. And like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, we will recognize the risen Lord. And recognize that the risen Lord is with us even now. Stay safe. Stay well. Stay in touch. Listen to your hearts. And may God bless us all in this new way.